This segment of WGCU's Untold Stories is underwritten by Lee County Government County Commission and the City of Fort Myers City Council.
With a gill net, you could strike and catch mullet every day when the tide was right, but now a boat swell is rolling over it every minute of the day, and they're not there anymore. Not many places are left for this kind of fishing, and what few places there still are where you might catch some mullet, there's someone there trying to catch fish, any kind of fish. Net fishing's about a thing of the past. I'm sad again when I think of it.
In 1995, Fisherfolk lamented the end of the commercial net fishing in southwest Florida when the state's controversial ban on entanglement nets went into effect. But long before the ban, pollution, overdevelopment, and a burgeoning population had already begun to take their toll, and fishing traditions thousands of years old began to vanish, along with the fish.
There's too many fishermen. That's part of the game. Then the red tide kills a lot of fish, and the power boats go over these flats where the fish lay their little eggs. I never thought I would see the day that I could not go out on the head of my dock and get a mess of fish.
From the ancient Calusa to the cracker pioneers, nets, like a tenuous thread through time, linked the fisherfolk of southwest Florida. In 1513, explorer Ponce de Leon landed somewhere in southwest Florida and discovered a complex culture that centered on fishing, not farming.
The Calusa, in the absence of agriculture, which is usually thought of as a prerequisite for civilization, did something that almost no other southeastern Native American culture was able to achieve, and that is resist Spanish intrusions and create this complex society and persist for a long time in great adversity. The Calusa fishing was primarily based on net fishing and also kind of stationary weirs where they'd have stakes in the estuary and the very shallow water.
By the early 1700s, the Calusa were nearly wiped out, victims of European diseases and overrun by Creek Indians fleeing English raiders in northern Florida and Georgia. Some of the Calusa fled to the Florida Keys and to the Spanish colony of Cuba, where, perhaps, some of their ancient fish-finding wisdom was preserved for future generations.
The documents say this, and my strong impression is that the Cuban fishermen hired some of these Calusa refugees, both living in the Keys and also in Cuba, and they brought them back and learned how to fish these waters from the Calusa. I think there's definitely continuity, and so to the extent that the Cuban fishermen passed on some of their knowledge into what we know today, the traditions of today, and the way commercial fishermen fish these waters and these estuaries, that living tradition in a way represents a survival of the Calusa culture. However filtered it may be through those centuries, it still represents something that people today are still doing that is at least a little bit influenced by this culture that is otherwise extinct.
Unlike the Calusa, the Cubans fished only during the winter, when the mullet were fat and full of roe.
The Cuban fishermen were here only for one season of the year. They didn't live here year-round, and they didn't rely exclusively on the fish for their subsistence. So they were, strictly speaking, the first truly commercial fishermen in this area.
Their part-time settlements were primitive and crude, merely makeshift huts clustered conveniently near the back bays.
We're on the east side of Usepa Island, which is a beautiful island in Pine Island Sound. It is now a private island. But 100, 150 years ago and 200 years ago, this was the settlement of some very poor Cuban fishermen. And they would build little thatched huts and settlements here and live here for several months as they fished before they brought the fish back to Cuba. The settlements that the Cuban fishermen had here had an unusual name that most people don't associate with fish, and they were called ranchos, R-A-N-C-H-O-S. And the ranchos were the working settlements of these fishermen that would gather on not only this island, but the other islands in this area. If you see some of the islands in the area of Yusepa that have Spanish names, like Patricio, Mondongo, Punta Blanca, and some of those places, that's where many of these settlements were, and that's how they got their name.
Gradually, some of the Cuban fishermen stayed longer and began to intermarry with the Creek Indians.
We have records of this evolving ethnic group that didn't even exist before, called Spanish Indians. And they were cousins of the Seminoles, but they were in South Florida long before the Seminoles got pushed down here in the 1800s. The Cuban fishing period became a really interesting mix of Cuban fishermen using partially Calusa techniques and intermarrying and interacting with Creek Indians, who are the very same ones that shot up the Calusa earlier.
By the 1830s, many of the Spanish Indians were being pushed out, innocent victims of the Seminole Wars. Under the federal government's Indian removal policy, anyone considered Indian, including the Spanish Indians, could be removed to Western reservations. Many of the wives and children of the Cuban fishermen were swept up in the removals, and the Cuban fishing communities were abandoned in Southwest Florida. Southwest Florida remained a remote no man's land until after the Civil War, when another generation of Cubans returned and reestablished the ranchos. George Good conducted surveys of the fishing operations in Charlotte Harbor in the 1870s and found major ranches on Captiva, Gasparilla Island, and 2 on Cayo Costa, including one on the northern tip of the island operated by Tariba Padilla and his wife, Juanita, whose descendants continued to live and fish on the island until the 1970s. Padilla's granddaughter, Esperanza Woodring, recalled what life was like on the island.
Mullet were caught in the winter when they were spawning. It would last about 3 months out of the year, November, December, and January. They probably made what they could in those 3 months, and then they survived with whatever they could rake and scrape out of the water, clams, oysters, and they ate a lot of fish. I don't remember seeing any money until I was grown. Money? Nobody knew what that was. They just traded back and forth whatever they had.
By the late 1800s, railroads and fish ice revolutionized Southwest Florida's fishing industry.
When the railroad was built by Henry Plant to Tampa in 1883, you started the Americanization of the fishing industry in Southwest Florida.
Fish companies opened near the railheads, and fish ice made drying and salting fish a thing of the past. Company fish houses were built in the back bays from Chokoloskee to Charlotte Harbor.
This is the last remaining section of the old fish houses here in Pine Island Sound that are over 100 years old in some cases. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, this whole area was dotted with these fish houses, and there's only about half a dozen left right here. And these fish houses were a combination bunkhouse and ice house. The fishermen in this area would bring their catch to these houses, and the catch would be put into the ice houses.
Company-run boats picked up the catch several times a week and dropped off ice and supplies for the fishermen. Harry Pete Goulding fished with his father Joseph in the early 1900s and recalled how the fish were packed for shipment.
Fancy fish, pompano, trout, mackerel, and king, were packed in wooden barrels made in a cooperage right on the dock. These went to northern cities. Bottom fish, or mullet, were placed in bins constructed in boxcars with alternating layers of fish and crushed ice.
Some fishermen set up temporary fish camps near the fish houses. Others, like the Padilla family on Cayo Costa, were situated right on the runboat route.
We had a runboat that used to come up there in Tarpon Bay and pick up our fish. If we wanted groceries or shoes or anything, we would just write up an order and send it back on the fish boat. The next boat would bring it down. One of the big shots at the Punta Gorda Fish Company used to brag that he knew the bra sizes of every fisherman's wife because he handled their orders to Sears Roebuck.
Some of the old rancho sites became small fishing settlements, including Punta Blanca.
Where we're sitting right now is the location of the old settler fishing village here from the turn of the century, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, all the way up until the 1930s. People lived here, and these foundations are the foundations of their homes and their workshops here. There was also a repair shop, a building, a marine railway that extended down into the water.
Nets continued to be the mainstay of the now booming fishing industry, but the natural fiber nets required constant care.
We first started out with cotton nets. All the twine was cotton. And the old timers way back would make lime out of fire, burning fire, the ash and everything, and they made lime. And when you got through fishing that day, you had this lime and water mixed up, looked like white paint, and you would wash down your nets with that.
Most of them stop nets were cotton, and they took and put them in tar to preserve them. Crabs ate them anyway, but not quite as bad.
A net wheel at Gasparilla Village was used to haul heavy nets from the fishing boats to lime and dry the vulnerable fibers.
I hate hanging nets and mending nets. If you have a net, you have to keep working on it. We had nets, one for every size fish in every season.
Nets ranged from stop and gill nets to large seine nets, most likely similar in form and function to the nets used by the Calusa centuries before.
They had what they called stop net, and you probably can see it now behind me. The tides go real low here, and it goes dry for miles in some places. You put your net out to where you know the water's going to stop. And as that tide falls, them fish move off them banks and they'll run into your net. And that was called stop net.
They would strike bunches of mullet in the fall with stop nets and would get 200,000 or 300,000 pounds.
Stop nets were so effective, they were outlawed in Florida in the 1930s. Mind-boggling catches were still possible, however, with large seine nets.
About sunup, 3 schools began to come through into one school. We put 4 nets around them and 6 in the center. I have never seen such a bunch of mullet, and what a sight it was when they found they were inside of a net fence. In a few minutes, every net was full as it could hold. We estimated 10,000 head. There were so many fish in this school. In a few minutes, all our nets were sunk down with mullet, and water was muddy as soup.
I used to mostly seine fish. That's where you strike on the beach and pull 'em ashore. Then you just bail 'em in the boat. I've done quite a bit of gill netting, but it was so much easier with that seine.
Gill nets were specifically designed in various mesh sizes to catch or gill only certain sizes of fish. Fish too small could swim through the mesh, and fish too large would bounce off the net. It took skill and stealth to slowly lower a gill net over the side of a sailboat or pole skiff and quietly circle the net around a school or pod of mullet.
They rode everywhere in this country. You could pole off the back with one oar, sculling it it's called, and then you could row with your back, or you'd face forward and you could work the oars like that. And they did most of their fishing at night because the fish would settle on banks and bars and stuff, and you could hear them flipping. And you'd row up there and you'd ease your net out, and then you'd start making racket, drop them into the nets.
We would pole the nets out in about 18-foot skiffs. They really are quieter. You could not strike out there in the middle very well with just one net because the fish would outrun you. If you had 2 boats, you could let go. You would put rubber on the back of the stern of your boat because that lead line hitting the boat would scare 'em. With that lead pounding on the stern, man, they'd take off.
As the fishing industry boomed, so did another industry, clamming.
It was back in the turn of the century. E.C. Burnham, which is a company down on Marco Island, had started first. And then Doxy in about 1911 came down.
About 25 clam diggers camped while digging clams on Little Pavilion Key at every low tide. This was done for several years and furnished all the clams for the Burnham factory at Caxambas, then for the Doxy canning at Marco. A good digger could dig about 25 bushels on one tide for 25 cents a bushel.
Business really was a manual labor business until a fellow by the name of William Collier no relation to Baron Collier, by the way, invented a dredge, and steam power replaced muscle power. Nobody foresaw the amount of bushels that they were going to be able to harvest. And Doxey and his factory were harvesting up to 6,000 bushels of clams a day and processing them and shipping them out.
This clam digging dredge could dig more clams per hour than 25 men could by hand, but it broke up lots of clams. Now the clams are gone, only dead shells where there were millions of good clams.
Eventually, the process in itself diminished the clam beds to a point where they couldn't regenerate anymore. And Burnham went out of business first in 1929. And Doxey took the plant over for a little while. And eventually, Doxey himself had to go out of business in 1947. Doxey took the plant down. On the spot where the plant was, by the way, he built a trailer park for about 90 spaces. But the name lives on. If you go into your store, you will see somewhere between the tuna fish, the salmon, Doxey clams.
Other fisheries continued to flourish, but one fish dominated the market: mullet. Caught almost entirely by nets, this important fishery was revolutionized in the early 1940s when see-through nylon nets, dubbed glass nets by the fisherfolk, were introduced.
I know a mullet's pretty smart, but I don't think he could see that glass net in the water. Why, that old 920 cotton net, it looked like a fence hanging out there.
Fisherfolk received another boost in 1945 when Naples fisherman Rob Storter invented a new kind of boat, with ironic results.
I was going to invent something that was going to be beneficial to fishermen or ruin a good skiff. I designed an inboard-outboard, a wonderful treat to fishermen. By cutting out the center of the skiff and putting the motor in the middle, the net can run itself out. All mullet fishermen soon had one. Oars and oarlocks are not used anymore. It sure helped the fishermen, but not the fish. It helped make fish harder to find. Fish will not tolerate traffic.
Just after World War II, Chokoloskee fisherman Loren Toch Brown forever changed Southwest Florida's commercial fishing industry by creating a market for the bothersome bycatch that sometimes clogged mullet fishermen's nets: stone crabs.
We started doing a lot of pompanoing along the coastline, about 3 miles out, with pompano nets. And when our net touched the bottom, I noticed we catching a lot of stone crabs. So I got the idea there must be some way to commercial them.
Working with his uncle, Dollar Bill, Brown built 8 experimental traps and set them out along Chokoloskee's coastline. They returned a week later to find a disappointing catch: 2 crabs. Through trial and error, however, Brown learned how to catch the crabs no one had ever tried to catch commercially before.
At that time, you took the whole crab and you kept it alive. And he would truck it over to Miami and peddle it out and try to get sales. Stone Crab Joe was his first customer, and that's where Stone Crab Joe got his name. It's a big booming industry today, but the cost of fuels and labor and everything, people say, why does the crab have to cost so much? But if you knew what it cost just for one of these big crab boats to leave the dock and come back, you'd understand.
Soon after Brown began marketing stone crabs, another crustacean was making headlines in Southwest Florida, nicknamed pink gold. In January 1950, the Collier County News heralded the discovery of jumbo shrimp just 35 miles offshore from Naples.
Hundreds of spectators turned out Wednesday to watch 6 big trawlers unload more than 29,000 pounds of shrimp, the first catches to be landed at the Combs Fish Docks in Naples. At 51 cents per pound, the total paid out to the boats was better than $15,000.
The shallow entrance into Naples, however, soon forced most of the new shrimping fleet to move north to Fort Myers Beach, where today the boats still unload their precious cargo of pink shrimp.
Well, in the earlier days, I guess there was probably in this port alone there was 200 or 300 boats, and a lot of boats offshore fishing. And when you come in, you know, sometimes long lines waiting to unload, and there was just more boats. There was a lot more money into it because the fuel prices were low, and shrimp prices were higher than what they are today.
Fort Myers Beach became the center of Southwest Florida's new shrimping industry. But there was a dark side to harvesting the pink gold called bycatch. The large trawl nets proved too efficient, pulling in everything in their path, including sea turtles. By the 1980s, new nets were designed with turtle excluder devices, or TEDs, that allowed large fish and sea turtles to escape.
In my opinion, if the turtle issue went away, most of the boats would pull the turtle excluders anyways because of the bycatch. Really, they don't want to catch the bycatch. It tears the shrimp up, and you got to deal with it when it gets aboard.
Today, tons of shrimp are still processed in Fort Myers Beach, but imports of foreign farm-raised shrimp and the value of waterfront property threaten this once booming industry in Southwest Florida.
Shrimping's going to be around forever. It's going to go through a lot more changes. It probably, in this area here, maybe even downsize a little bit more. The main factor, the land is so expensive that fishing, if you're somebody that owned a piece of land and somebody come in and offer you $10 million for it, they usually sell it, so it makes it hard. If we lose all the land for the fisheries, I don't know what would happen. I guess they'd have to go to the northern Gulf and maybe come down here and fish and go back up there.
Not all threats to Southwest Florida's fishing industries are new. For centuries, a mysterious malady has caused extensive fish kills throughout the region.
The earliest reporting of red tide, or poison water as it was frequently called, on the west coast of Florida would have been between 1530 and 1550. In 1946 and 47, it was estimated that the red tide killed over 1 billion fish.
When I was a kid, they called it the poison water. They did not know what it was, and it killed tons of fish. In 1947, that red tide was the worst I ever saw. The fish were knee-deep all along the beaches, piled up, dead.
In 1947, Fisherfolk in the 10,000 Islands faced another challenge when President Truman dedicated the new Everglades National Park.
When Truman came and sat up there, I was just a small child, but I do remember that. And Truman was sincere, and he promised the people here if we would let the park come in, it would not interfere with our lifestyle and our ways of making a living. Well, as long as he was in office, that was so, see. But of course, as they changed, then the park began taking more and more land from us and started putting more laws and more bans, and it was devastating.
Tourists and tin canners, the mocking name locals gave to campers, began to compete with the commercial fishermen for a diminishing supply of fish, and increasing regulations earned the ire of the fisherfolk.
Someone told me that old Tiwi was going to have to quit fishing. He just couldn't make enough money to carry Laura along with him in the boat and tell him where, when, and how to fish.
Granddaddy gave me my first net, and that was one of his rules. You don't fish if there's fish there, but you're always going to have fish there. If you just take a little here and you go somewhere else and take a little there, you just don't sit there and wipe them out like these sports fishermen like to do. We had to make a living at it, so we weren't out to try to catch every little wiggling thing because we had to make a check the next week.
Declining catches prompted a blame game between commercial fisherfolk and sports fishermen, resulting in the passage of a constitutional amendment that created a statewide ban on entanglement nets in 1995.
Whether this was a conservation effort or not is certainly questionable. You had a basic conflict between the commercial net fishing industry and the commercial sports fishing industry, and the sports fishing industry won. In my lifetime, Florida has grown from slightly over 1 million people to about 17 million people. And the projection is that it will grow even faster in the future. The more people that you have, the more pressure that there is on the fish that are out there in our bays and inlets and rivers and creeks. And the commercial fishing industry, I don't think, has any chance whatever of surviving under an urbanized Florida. It's the loss of a very important industry and it certainly is a cultural loss to the state.
For every fish you take out of the sea, there's one less fish in the sea. It don't matter if he jumps in the boat, he's not out there anymore. It comes down to one thing, it's people. There's just too many people now.
The reason we have the Everglades Island airboat tours is because we were all commercial fishermen. And a way of making a life, it ended. When you stop from use of nets and say you can catch 50 head a day or whatever, that is not an income. It really emotionally it's very disturbing to me because all of my heritage and all of that is just going down the tube.
One of the reasons that it's so important for all our fisheries to survive, if they can't survive, the big question is, can we?
To purchase a copy of this and other WGCU-produced programs, go to WGCU.org or call 1-888-824-0030. This program was produced for the citizens of Southwest Florida by WGCU Public Media. Show your appreciation for programs like these. Become a member of WGCU, a business supporter, or leave a legacy through estate or planned gift. Call or visit our website at WGCU.org.